What if your marriage wasn't love? It was a hostile takeover. I thought I married into legacy, into love. But behind the estate gates and polished smiles was a system designed to control, manipulate, and profit off women like me. They called it tradition. I called it what it was, financial entrapment. This is the story of how I uncovered their blueprint, exposed decades of hidden abuse, and turned their empire of silence into a reckoning. If you've ever been underestimated, used, or told to be grateful while being stripped of your autonomy, this story is for you. Let me show you what happens when the asset fights back. I didn't marry into a family. I was purchased by one. That thought struck me as I stared at the header of the printed email spread across my dining table. The subject line was short, precise, cold. Subject: target acquired trajectory exceeds initial projections. It was dated 2 weeks after the Chicago Marketing Summit. 2 weeks after I met Graham Whitman. I used to romanticize that weekend. Graham in his tailored Navy suit, complimenting my presentation like he saw something in me no one else ever had. But now, under the harsh white kitchen light, the memory felt stripped of warmth. Every compliment, every weekend getaway, every bouquet of peonies calculated. Outside our high-rise apartment, the city twinkled, oblivious. Inside, the silence was deafening. Graham had gone to meet his father, Walter. Something about realigning financial priorities. I didn't ask. I was done asking. My phone buzzed. It was a text from Judith Whitman. "It's time you contribute properly, Madeline. Your family now. No hello, no how are you, just entitlement, wrapped in velvet." I pushed my untouched glass of red wine aside and walked into the home office. Everything in this place had been selected by Judith and her decorator. The ivory curtains, the mahogany desk, the gold-framed oil painting of coastal Maine. Even the pen set bore the Whitman family crest. I used to think it was generosity. Now I saw it for what it was. A branding. Sitting at the desk, I pulled out the manila envelope I had hidden behind its row of meaningless corporate plaques. Inside were bank statements, annotated screenshots, and transaction logs I'd gathered over the past month. Each one told a quiet story. Thousands of dollars transferred from our joint account to various Whitman-owned LLCs. Payments labeled as Whitman Legacy Pool or G. Whitman Holdings disguised as household renovations. None of which I had authorized. My name was on everything. My money funded it all. And yet I had never once been asked. A low hum pulled me out of my thoughts. The apartment's central speaker system had auto-connected to Graham's phone. He must have left it behind. Without thinking, I tapped the screen and a voice filled the room. It was Judith. "She's done well, yes. Better than expected. Walter thinks her next promotion will make her worth double. You just have to keep her aligned. Mind her, this is what family does." My fingers trembled as I paused the recording. Every muscle in my body went still. They didn't even bother hiding it anymore. I wasn't a partner. I was an asset, an acquisition. There was a knock at the door. I froze, heart hammering. It wasn't Graham. He always texted first. I approached slowly and checked the peephole. No one. Just a small envelope slid beneath the door. I picked it up. No return address. Inside was a single note, typed, "You're not the first. Let's talk. R." My breath caught. R. Rebecca. Graham's sister. The only person at those family dinners who looked like she might scream, but swallowed it instead. Maybe I wasn't as alone as I thought. I sat back down, note in hand, and opened my laptop. I created a new folder, Operation Autonomy. The war they started at that dining table. It wasn't going to end with a signature. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in the living room with the city glowing around me like a false promise. I wrapped myself in the gray wool blanket Graham had gifted me on our first Valentine's Day. The one I now realized Judith had probably picked out. I stared through the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the red eyes of planes blink. across the dark sky, each one carrying people somewhere else, somewhere freer. At 3:12 a.m., I opened a fresh document titled Personal Financial History, Whitman Intersection. My fingers hovered over the keys, but the words poured out faster than I could think. Every detail came back with surgical clarity. The moment Graham insisted we merge our checking accounts to simplify things. The sudden influx of Whitman-branded projects needing temporary financial bridges. And the way Judith always made her comments with a smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. They weren't careless. That was what made this insidious. It wasn't fraud in the traditional sense. It was cultural conditioning, packaged in designer suits and passed down like heirlooms. The Whitmans didn't just marry for love. They invested. They recruited, and I'd been a damn good investment. A soft ping broke the silence. My email. A message from an address I didn't recognize, r.harrison.private@gmail.com. Subject, not in public, do you still run? Body, meet me at the Lakefront Trail North Side, 7:00 a.m. Bring nothing Whitman branded. R. I stared at the message. The reference to running, she remembered. During one of those exhausting weekends at the Whitman estate in Connecticut, I'd mentioned I ran to clear my head. Rebecca had raised an eyebrow and said, "Then I suggest you run often." I changed into plain black leggings and a dark hoodie, shoved the email printout and Judith's voice recording into an inside pocket, and tied my sneakers with slow, deliberate fingers. Graham wouldn't be back until noon. Meeting with Walter about the family's short-term liquidity strategy, whatever that meant. The sun was barely up as I jogged to the lakefront. Mist hung low over the water, giving the skyline a dreamlike haze. I spotted Rebecca before she noticed me, standing with her back straight, arms crossed, no makeup, hair pulled into a loose ponytail that made her look 10 years younger. She didn't wave, just turned and started walking. I followed. Neither of us spoke until we were far enough from the path that even whispers wouldn't carry. "I'm sorry," she said finally. "I should have warned you." "You were part of it," I said, not as an accusation, but a statement of fact. "I was." Her voice was steady. "But I got out before Daniel did. He didn't. He lost everything." I remembered Daniel, her husband, always smiling, always quiet, gone from the Whitman gatherings 2 years ago. Now I understood why. Rebecca handed me a flash drive. "Start with this. It's not just you, Madeline. The pattern's older than you think." "What do they call it?" I asked. "Internally, I mean, what name do they give it?" She didn't hesitate. Asset absorption. It landed in my gut like a stone. They chart projections on spouses before the first date. Walter and Judith have files, spreadsheets, risk tiers, ROI timelines. They knew your bonus would come in this year. I closed my eyes, breathing through the sharp rush of nausea. "You're not alone anymore," Rebecca added. "But they'll come for you harder now, especially if they know you've started digging." I nodded slowly. Let them. As we parted ways beneath the ghostly silhouette of a fog-bound skyscraper, I felt it. A shift. Not fear, not panic, power. They had labeled me as an asset. But they forgot the first rule of investment. Assets can divest too. Charlotte Reynolds had a way of speaking that made people believe her before she even finished a sentence. Maybe it was the way she dressed. Tailored gray suits with zero jewelry, or the fact that she never blinked when she talked numbers. But when she looked at me across her glass conference table and said, "This isn't just financially abusive, Madeline. It's engineered." I felt my spine straighten, like I was back in the boardroom. Her office sat on the 22nd floor of a quiet financial consultancy firm in Boston, a city I had retreated to under the guise of a brand orbit project. No one in the Whitman orbit knew I was here. That was the point. Charlotte flipped through the color-coded tabs in the binder I'd brought. My binder. Graham had once called it my paranoia folder, but Charlotte called it evidence. "You've been funding nearly 70% of all household expenses for the last 10 months, she said, tapping a line in the spreadsheet. "This includes things you never agreed to, like a $12,500.00 family retreat last spring that was coded as a consulting fee to Whitman Legacy Trust. I had stared at that transaction for days before coming here, unable to make sense of it. Now it made perfect sense. "None of this is illegal per se," Charlotte continued. "It's manipulative, sure, but unless we prove coercion or that your signature was forged, we're looking at a case of strategic entanglement, not fraud." "That's what they do," I said quietly. "They make you complicit before you know you've agreed." Charlotte nodded. "We'll build backwards. Start with visibility. I'll help you separate every financial stream, bank accounts, retirement, property, investments. We'll start routing your income to a new account under your name only." I exhaled slowly. A new account, a simple act, but it felt like slicing the first thread of a web that had taken years to spin around me. There was a knock on the frosted glass door. Charlotte's assistant peeked in. "Sandra Miller is here." Perfect timing. Sandra walked in wearing sharp black heels and a calm, almost surgical expression. Family law attorney, reputation for discretion, and, most importantly, not on any Whitman payroll. She sat beside me and opened her folder. "I've reviewed your marital agreement. It's thin, designed to favor open access, no prenup clauses. But we can establish grounds for financial boundary enforcement." "Can we call it what it is?" I asked. "Financial colonization?" Sandra smirked. "I've seen worse, but this is up there. We spent the next hour mapping out the architecture of my entrapment. Joint accounts structured to allow Graham to move funds without notice, trust contributions tied to my performance bonuses, even the Whitman's favorite tactic, spousal projection sheets. They'd literally forecast my earnings like I'm a stock. Because to them, you are, Sandra said. "But here's where it gets interesting." She slid forward a document Rebecca had quietly forwarded to me, an internal Whitman memo labeled Spousal Value Forecast Q1 Consolidated. It included a line item marked Mem Whitman, value increase projected post-promotion, liquidation potential, moderate risk. I went cold. Charlotte looked over my shoulder. "You're not a wife to them, you're a fund." I closed the folder slowly. "Then it's time to pull out my capital." That evening, I checked into a small boutique hotel in Cambridge under my maiden name, Madeline Kerr. The desk clerk barely looked up, just handed me the key card with a tired smile and told me breakfast ran until 10. Perfect. Anonymity was what I craved now, the comfort of being unseen. I collapsed onto the bed without turning on the lights. For the first time in months, I felt my body let go, of the tightness in my chest, of the hypervigilance that had followed every family dinner, every friendly reminder from Judith about my obligations. Even the silence felt under here. I pulled my laptop from my tote and plugged in the flash drive Rebecca had given me. A folder popped up, asset_forecast_wives. Inside subfolders labeled with first names, Jennifer, Caroline, Rita, Lauren, and one marked redacted. My breath caught. Each folder contained PDF assessments, earnings histories, personality evaluations, and emails. Emails from Walter and Judith, most of them eerily transactional. I clicked into Jennifer's first. She had been married to William, one of the quieter cousins, a hedge fund VP. Her assessment detailed how her biomedical patents could be integrated into Whitman Pharmaceutical Holdings. Notes in the margin: high ROI, low risk of dissent, emotionally dependent. Then came the final document: separation exit strategy. Jennifer L. The settlement amount: $2,300.00. $2,300 after 5 years of marriage and intellectual property worth millions. I scrolled further until I found one marked M. Whitman. My name, my life. It was dated a year ago, 2 weeks before the engagement party. Subject: strategic integration. Madeline K. Body, career trajectory favorable, bonus structure aligns with Q4 goals, family connections minimal, advantageous primary weakness, tendency toward independence. Recommend early integration via joint financial channels. Risk mitigated by emotional attachment. I stared at the screen, heart pounding, pulse in my ears. They had read me like a report, like a formula, and they had planned my financial assimilation before Graham even proposed. A sound crackled from my phone. I'd forgotten to disconnect from the shared cloud account. A voice memo had synced automatically. I tapped play. Judith's voice again. You need to steer her before she starts asking the wrong questions. Remind her what family means, Graham. We don't need another Jennifer. I flung the phone across the bed. My chest felt hollow, rage curling in slow, poisonous circles. They had studied me. Every strength I'd built, every scar I'd earned climbing out of poverty, they had reduced it all to potential returns. I was an equation, a transaction. But they'd miscalculated something. Emotion. When you're the asset, they never expect you to become the threat. I spent the next hour encrypting the files and sending them to a private legal vault Charlotte had set up earlier that day. One copy went to Sandra, another to Rebecca, who responded instantly. Understood, they're already nervous. By the time I finally powered down, the sky outside was charcoal blue. I stood at the window, looking out over the Charles River. Lights flickered on across the buildings, each one containing its own story, some tragic, some triumphant. Mine wasn't over. Not yet. I didn't want revenge, not exactly. What I wanted was sovereignty, and now I had the blueprint. The invitation came by courier, wrapped in gold-trimmed vellum, sealed with the Whitman crest. It looked like something out of a royal gala. Inside, a handwritten note in Judith's tight cursive. Family strategy dinner. Formal attire, 7 p.m. sharp. Your presence is expected. Expected, not requested. I stared at the note for a long moment, then folded it neatly and placed it in the shredder. Graham tried to act casual about it later that night as he poured 2 glasses of wine. Just a small family gathering. Dad wants to go over some end-of-year planning. You know how he gets about timelines. I kept my expression neutral. A strategy dinner? He paused, glass hovering midair. More of a discussion, really. With leather-bound folders and a projector. He blinked, caught off guard. I smiled and took the wine from his hand. I'll be there, I said, but I'll bring my own presentation. Graham chuckled, trying to turn it into a joke. You always over-prepare. No, Graham, I said quietly. This time, I'm just prepared. That Saturday, I arrived 5 minutes early at the Whitman estate in Greenwich, Connecticut. The chauffeur barely looked at me before opening the car door and gesturing toward the entrance. Even the help knew this wasn't a dinner. It was a board meeting. The foyer gleamed under crystal chandeliers. Staff bustled like stagehands prepping for a show. Through the grand doors, I glimpsed the long mahogany table already set, not with place settings, but with navy blue leather portfolios, a screen lowered at the far end. Walter stood at the head of the room, remote in hand, as if he were about to present quarterly earnings. Ah, Madeline, he said without warmth, so glad you could join us. I gave him a calm nod and walked past Graham, who looked pale under the golden light. Judith greeted me with air kisses that didn't graze skin. You look tired, dear. Overworked. Focused, I corrected. The chairs filled with familiar faces, Rebecca and Daniel seated stiffly, Uncle Harris and Aunt Loretta, who rarely spoke unless prompted, and William, looking smug as ever. At the center, an empty seat waited for me, flanked by Judith and Graham like ceremonial guards. I didn't sit. Instead, I placed a slim leather folio, my own, on the seat, and looked up at Walter. I brought some notes of my own. I assume there's room on the agenda. Judith's smile cracked. Walter hesitated but nodded once. Of course. The lights dimmed, and the first slide of Walter's presentation lit the room in pale blue light. Whitman Family Legacy Resource Consolidation Strategy 2023. He began droning on about legacy, sustainability, shared sacrifice, all buzzwords masking one truth: the expectation that we would contribute unquestioningly. Each family member's name appeared on screen with graphs and figures. Contribution percentages, earnings projections, performance metrics. Then came my slide. Madeline Whitman earning potential. High contribution capacity. 50%. Moderate closely. The air in the room shifted. Eyes turned to me. Judith leaned in, voice velvet-coated steel. We all give, Madeline. That's what being a Whitman means. I let the silence stretch just a moment longer than polite. Then I smiled. Funny, I always thought being a Whitman meant taking. Judith's face tightened, and from the other end of the table, Rebecca's gaze flickered. Just a glint, but enough. Someone else saw it too. This wasn't just legacy, it was a transaction, and I was done being the currency. Walter clicked to the next slide. A new graph appeared. My projected earnings over the next 5 years, tracked against past performance bonuses and family opportunity growth. The phrase made my stomach turn. This trajectory, Walter explained, pointer circling a peak marked Q3, Q4, bonus 2024, positions Madeline to be a pivotal contributor in our multi-generational strategy. A 50% allocation is not only feasible, it's consistent with our family values. Family values? I counted slowly in my head to keep from laughing. Judith sat poised beside me, perfectly still except for her fingers tapping the table. 3 beats, pause, repeat. Her signature pattern when she was preparing to strike. I opened my own folio. No leather, no crest. Just facts. I have a few questions, I said, my voice clear, specifically regarding the language of allocation and the legal structure behind this so-called family pool. Who owns the pool? Who audits it? And where exactly do the funds go? The room tensed. Across the table, Daniel looked down at his lap. Rebecca stared ahead blankly. Walter raised a brow. We've never had issues of transparency before. These contributions are made in good faith. Faith is not a financial strategy, I said, sliding a printed chart across the table. This shows 5 separate transactions from the Whitman Legacy Fund to private holding accounts tied to William, all within 3 days of last year's holiday contribution. No return reporting, no advisory notes. William's face flushed. That's business reinvestment. No documentation says that, I replied calmly. In fact, none of this is documented properly, not by IRS standards, not by fiduciary standards, and certainly not by any ethical metric I've seen in my career. Judith leaned in, voice low and sharp. This isn't a courtroom, Madeline. Then why does it feel like a deposition? For a moment, only the soft buzz of the projector filled the silence. I stood and walked to the screen, unplugging Walter's laptop with a practiced flick. Then, from my bag, I pulled out a small USB and connected it. A new slide flashed to life. Financial autonomy and investment ethics, personal safeguards in family wealth structures. Walter's mouth twitched, but he said nothing. My contribution, I said, is contingent on 3 conditions. A full third-party audit of all family-controlled financial entities, a formal separation of spousal assets with legal protections for all parties, and a written commitment that future contributions will be optional and fully documented, Judith snapped. We don't bend for ultimatums. And I don't bleed for secrets. I turned toward the others. I've reviewed the spreadsheets. I've seen the patterns. This system doesn't just exploit. It absorbs. It turns marriage into acquisition, loyalty into leverage, and frankly, I didn't sign up for that. The silence after was long and stifling. Graham looked shell-shocked, lips parted like he wanted to speak but didn't know which side he was on anymore. Walter finally nodded once. 1 week, he said. You'll submit your final terms, we'll reconvene and decide as a family. I gathered my materials, slowly, deliberately. As I turned to leave, I glanced at Rebecca. Her face was unreadable, but as our eyes met, she offered the smallest nod. A signal. Confirmation. We weren't just rewriting the rules. We were burning the original contract. Outside, the wind bit sharp across the Whitman estate's wide stone steps. I didn't feel it. What I felt was clarity. The following Monday, I arrived at the Whitman estate, not in demure silk or pastel crepe like Judith would have preferred, but in a charcoal gray pantsuit with structured shoulders and a portfolio under my arm. I parked in the far lot, walked alone up the marble steps, and paused beneath the arched entrance, where months earlier I'd been welcomed as the bright new bride. Now, no one greeted me. The door was already open. Inside, the air buzzed with a strange, brittle tension. No small talk. No pretense. The long dining table had been replaced by a conference setup. Rows of chairs, screen, ready-chilled water bottles lined precisely along a linen runner. Judith sat upright near the head of the table, her lips pressed so tightly they looked bloodless. Graham stood behind her, adjusting his cufflink like he hadn't slept in days. Walter, as always, was composed. Measuring. "Madeline," he said, standing, his voice neutral. "We've convened this session at your request. I trust you've come prepared." "I have," I said, plugging my laptop into the projector without hesitation. The screen lit up. Financial Autonomy and Investment Ethics, a case study in familial oversight and asset protection. Judith visibly flinched. Walter arched one brow. "I appreciate your time," I said, voice steady. "This will take exactly 18 minutes. Afterward, I will distribute hard copies of my proposal, along with documentation justifying every clause." I clicked to the first slide, historical contributions, Visa's individual ROI. On the right, a stacked bar graph, years of pooled contributions by various family members. On the left, another chart, withdrawals and reinvestment channels. A yellow-headed set of figures pointed directly to William. I traced over $420,000, 0 cents, redirected from the family pool in 2 shell entities, managed by Whitman Holdings, I explained. None of it recorded as returns, no reporting, no transparency. William opened his mouth to object, but Walter raised a hand. Continue. Slide 2, gendered allocation expectations. A table comparing male and female spouses' contributions. Every wife had contributed more relative to income. Every husband had withdrawn more. Slide 3, spousal value forecasts. Internal documents. I displayed the memo from my own profile. Madeline Whitman, high yield, moderate risk. Monitor post-promotion, and beside it, Jennifer's intellectual property acquisition potential, low emotional stability. This, I said, pointing to the phrase intellectual property acquisition, refers to a patent Jennifer held during her marriage to William. It was absorbed into a Whitman-affiliated pharmaceutical branch 6 months before her divorce. She received nothing. Walter's expression didn't change, but Judith's eyes darkened. I paused, letting the room absorb it. Then clicked to the final slide, my terms. I read them aloud, one by one. Complete financial separation between me and the Whitman Family Trust. Any future contributions to be voluntary, auditable, and legally contractual. A third-party forensic audit of all existing family investments involving spousal income within the past decade. A declaration that no decisions about my finances will ever be made without my explicit written consent. A silence fell, so absolute it rang in my ears. Judith stood abruptly. "This is absurd. You don't dictate terms to this family." I looked at her without blinking. Neither do you. Her mouth opened, but Walter spoke first. She's done her homework. Judith spun to him, stunned. You can't be serious. I didn't say I agreed, he said coolly. I said she's not bluffing. I reached into my folder and pulled out sealed copies of my proposal, sliding them to each attendee. You have 1 week to review and respond. After that, any further contact will be through legal counsel. Graham stared at me, expression unreadable. You can talk to me now, he said quietly, privately. I did talk, I replied. You just didn't listen. And with that, I unplugged the laptop, tucked it under my arm, and walked out of the room, leaving behind the same silence they had once weaponized against me. But this time, I had taken the air with me. I didn't drive straight back to Chicago. I rerouted to a small law office in Hartford, neutral ground, off Whitman radar, and the one place Sandra Miller had set up to receive all correspondence related to the family trust negotiations. I handed her the signed master copy of the proposal, then sank into the leather chair across from her, letting out the breath I hadn't realized I'd been holding since Greenwich. Sandra reviewed each page methodically. They'll resist the audit the most, she said, tapping the clause in red. That's where the skeletons live. They've built an empire on other people's silence, I said. I don't intend to be one of them. She nodded. Rebecca confirmed her own financial records were altered after her second pregnancy. Contributions increased without notice. I thought of Rebecca in that room, rigid, quiet, watching me, as if her breath was tied to mine. Maybe this wasn't just my fight anymore. As I stood to leave, Sandra paused me. They'll try something before the week's out. They already have, I said. They just didn't expect me to bring charts. Back at the hotel, I opened my inbox to find a new email. No subject line, just a .zip attachment titled Jennifer_exit_assets_confidential. The sender, r.harrison.private@tmail.com. I opened it. Inside were scans of Jennifer's divorce agreement, bank transfers, correspondence between William and a corporate attorney who'd advised him on neutralizing potential IP claims, and buried in one PDF, a message from Judith to Walter: once Jennifer's value dries up, we'll exit quietly. There's no legacy in sentiment. No legacy in sentiment? It echoed through me like a gunshot in an empty hallway. Before I could process it further, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. I hesitated, then answered. Madeline Whitman? The voice was calm, low. Speaking? This is Jacob Stone. I represent the Internal Audit Division for Westmark Investments. Your husband submitted a shared portfolio inquiry under your name last year. We flagged inconsistencies and attempted follow-up. No response. Until now. I swallowed. What kind of inconsistency? Your signature was copied from an earlier file and used to authorize a $250,000 0-cents fund reallocation into Whitman Financials. We're now required to report the potential breach. I closed my eyes. Can you send me everything? Already did, he said. Check your secure inbox. I hung up slowly. There it was. The move before the deadline. They hadn't just absorbed my income. They'd forged my consent. And now there was a paper trail. In the quiet of the room, I opened my encrypted drive and added the new files to the vault Charlotte had built. Then I called Rebecca. Time to widen the circle, I said. It's bigger than we thought. There was a pause. Then her voice, resolute. I'll call Jennifer. She still has the contact list. Outside the window, snow began to fall, soft and indifferent, like it had every year. But this time it didn't feel peaceful. It felt like cover. Which was fine. I didn't need sunshine for what came next. I just needed the right kind of silence. The kind that settles before something shakes. The cafe was tucked between a used bookstore and a dry cleaner, the kind of place that looked deliberately unremarkable. A hand-painted sign in the window read, "Coffee first, then strategy," and the smell of burnt espresso grounds hit me before I'd even pushed the door open. Jennifer was already seated at the back, hoodie pulled low, no makeup, a faded MIT sweatshirt barely visible beneath her peacoat. If I hadn't seen her photo in the Whitman family archive, I wouldn't have recognized her. The last time I'd heard her name was in Judith's voice, laced with disdain. Jennifer didn't understand the arrangement. That's why she walked away with nothing. Now, Jennifer looked up at me with eyes that had seen too much. "You're younger than I was," she said without preamble. I sat, and apparently just as stupid. She gave a tired laugh and slid a USB drive across the table. "That's everything I saved before they froze me out. IP drafts, legal correspondence, and a list of other spouses who've been absorbed." The word landed harder in person. "I thought I was the only one," I said quietly. "No one ever is," she replied, folding her hands. "That's what makes the system work. It relies on isolation, silence. Dignified wives don't talk about finances." I took the drive, pocketing it without breaking eye contact. I'm not interested in being dignified. I'm interested in ending this. Jennifer looked past me, scanning the cafe before leaning in. "Rebecca told me you've already exposed the financial structure." "That's huge, but if you really want to tear this down, you'll need one thing more." "What?" "Someone from inside the structure. Someone who helped build it." I paused. "Walter?" She shook her head. "No, he'll never crack. But there's someone else. A woman named Elena Voss. She was the Whitman family's original legal architect. Handled the early legacy trusts, the marital integration policies. She disappeared after Rebecca's second pregnancy. Word is Judith pushed her out when she refused to backdate a few asset transfers. Where is she now? No one knows. But Jennifer pulled out a folded receipt from her coat. "I do know someone who might." It was a dry cleaning ticket, small blue, stamped with the name All Seasons Cleaners, Bridgeport, CT. Elena left a garment there, something with a name stitched in. She used to send me there too back when she was still trying to help. If her name's still on file, it could be a lead. I took it and looked back up at Jennifer. "Why are you helping me?" Her eyes burned, but her voice stayed level. "Because I didn't have a Rebecca or a you. I was too ashamed, too broke, and too scared to fight back. You're not, so don't waste the fire." I nodded. "What happened to your patents?" "They still hold partial rights, but I filed a motion last year to reclaim licensing ownership. It's pending." "Good," I said. "Let's make sure that motion doesn't get buried." She smiled faintly. "You talk like someone used to losing. And done with it." "Exactly." My phone buzzed with a message from Sandra. "Call me. Westmark investigators escalated the claim. Legal team wants meeting." Jennifer caught the look on my face. They're cornered. Then let's tighten the circle. I stood, sliding my untouched coffee away. "This time we're the ones writing the contracts." I drove to Bridgeport that afternoon under a slate gray sky, windshield wipers squeaking across light snow that wasn't sticking but threatened to. The dry cleaner was exactly as Jennifer described, cramped, fluorescent lit, and buried beneath years of unpaid advertising posters. A man in his 60s stood behind the counter, polishing a smudge on a rotating rack of long, forgotten coats. "Can I help you?" he asked, eyes not quite meeting mine. I slid the slip across the counter. "I'm picking up for Elena Voss." His hands froze for a beat, just long enough to confirm the name meant something. Then he took the ticket, turned to a narrow drawer, and pulled out a small paper ledger with the kind of neat, looping handwriting that only exists in businesses untouched by digital systems. "She left this coat in 9, he muttered, pulling the rack manually. "Never came back for it." The item he retrieved was a dark navy trench, clean and pressed, still sealed in its plastic wrap. A small cream tag peeked from the collar. E. Voss embroidered in navy thread. But it wasn't the coat that mattered. It was what I felt tucked inside the inner lining. "Mind if I check the pockets?" I asked. He shrugged. "Been sitting here 13 years, might as well." Inside the breast pocket was a folded piece of heavy paper, thicker than standard stock. I opened it cautiously. It was a notarized document stamped and signed. Whitman Family Holdings. Memorandum of Spousal Integration Protocol revoked, 2009. Across the top, scribbled in what I assumed was Elena's handwriting, "They'll deny this exists." But it does. I slipped the document into my portfolio and left Bridgeport with a weight in my lap I hadn't realized I was carrying. Back in Boston, I called Charlotte. She picked up on the second ring. I think I just found our Rosetta Stone. Within the hour, Charlotte, Sandra, and I were on a 3-way Zoom call reviewing the document. Sandra's eyes widened as she read the second clause aloud. "All spousal financial contributions to Whitman Trust Holdings shall be considered conditional unless explicitly documented and countersigned by said spouse's legal representative." Charlotte leaned forward. "This means every transfer you've made without that condition is voidable." "And not just mine," I said. "Rebecca? Jennifer? Caroline? Every wife they pulled into this system." Sandra nodded. "If Elena filed this before she was forced out, and we can prove it, this isn't just personal, it's systemic abuse with legal consequences." Charlotte clicked her tongue thoughtfully. "We could build a class action." I looked into the camera. "No, not could. We will." Rebecca texted an hour later with 2 words, "Jennifer's ready." Attached was a spreadsheet. Projected net worth per spouse, 20112022, labeled clearly, "Internal draft, not for distributed." Each column was brutal: name, expected yield, exit cost, IP retained, post-divorce value rating. Next to my name in bold red, "Pending leverage." I stared at that phrase until it blurred, and then I highlighted it, copied it, and pasted it onto a blank slide titled "Final Presentation, The Reckoning." The circle was closing, not out of revenge, out of record-keeping, out of justice, out of finally being seen not as leverage, but as the ledger they never expected to answer for. The conference room at Whitman Legal and Estate Partners was perched high over Midtown Manhattan, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a panoramic view of the city. On any other day, the glittering skyline might have impressed me. Today, it felt like set dressing. A show of dominance. But I wasn't here to be dazzled. I was here to close the file. Walter arrived first, flanked by 2 estate attorneys in bespoke suits. He carried a leather folio and a look of composed calculation, as if he were about to buy a company he already owned. Judith was conspicuously absent. According to Graham, she'd flown to Palm Beach 2 days earlier. "She's unwell," he'd said. I didn't ask for details. I didn't need them. Graham entered last, tie slightly loose, jaw clenched. His usual polish was dulled, like someone had finally wiped the veneer clean and revealed the raw wood beneath. I looked at him and felt nothing. Not anger, not pity. Just distance. "Shall we begin?" Walter asked, settling into the head chair. I nodded and slid a bound packet across the table. "These are my final terms. They have not changed." Sandra, seated beside me with her usual unshakable poise, handed out copies to Walter's attorneys. "Full financial separation," one of them read aloud. "Third-party forensic audit of all Whitman Trust. Funds connected to spousal income. Legal release of all prior contributions made under assumed marital obligation. He glanced up. You do understand this audit request opens decades of closed books. I do, I replied. And so will the IRS if we can't agree today. Walter's jaw tightened ever so slightly. You're bluffing, Charlotte's voice cut in from the far end of the table. Actually, we've already initiated a preliminary disclosure through Westmark's regulatory division. Their internal investigators triggered the mandatory report clause last Friday. Walter turned to Graham. You knew about this. Graham didn't respond. Instead, he looked at me. Is there a version of this where we walk out together? I stared at him. This man who once held my hand as I spoke about my dreams, who had memorized the taste of my favorite tea and smiled when I laughed in my sleep. Then I remembered the signature forged on the Westmark reallocation form. No, I said softly. Because you didn't just stand beside me. You signed behind my back. Walter shifted in his seat, his calculation now tinged with caution. And what is it you actually want, Madeline? He asked, like a man trying to reframe a deal just before it implodes. Freedom, I said. Not just mine. All of us. I opened the folder and pulled out a printed spreadsheet. Jennifer's file. Do you recognize this? I asked. He studied it for a second before leaning back. This wasn't approved for distribution? It didn't need to be, I said. It existed, that's enough. Across the table, one of Walter's attorneys cleared his throat. Given the scope of exposure, we'd advise Mr. Whitman to consider mediation. Walter nodded slowly. You'll have your separation. The audit, we'll negotiate scope. You can choose transparency or headlines. He paused, then nodded again. We'll comply. I stood, gathering my things with deliberate calm. Charlotte and Sandra followed suit. Graham stood too. Madeline, please. I looked back once. You had chances. So did your father. This isn't punishment. It's accountability. And as we walked out, past the sleek glass doors and silent assistants, I felt a stillness settle in my chest. Not relief, not triumph, just truth. And that was enough. A week after the settlement was finalized, I stood at the railing of Rebecca's modest Brooklyn apartment, coffee in hand, watching the late March light stretch across a skyline that no longer intimidated me. Inside, her children laughed over a jigsaw puzzle, and in the kitchen, Jennifer and Caroline sorted through sealed envelopes, each one containing signed declarations of financial independence from their ex-husband. The atmosphere buzzed with quiet resolve. No shouting, no headlines, just the soft rustling of women taking back their names. Rebecca joined me at the balcony. You look different, she said, leaning her elbows beside mine, like someone who finally exhaled. I did, I said. 12 years of holding my breath. She sipped her tea, then reached into her cardigan and pulled out a folded note. From Elena. I opened it slowly, fingers brushing the familiar sharp handwriting. Madeline. You've done what I couldn't, what I wasn't strong enough or safe enough to finish. But you've also started something bigger than the Whitmans. If you're ready, there are others. Elena Voss, I looked up. Others, Rebecca nodded. Turns out the Whitmans weren't the only ones with a system. Later that day, we gathered at a quiet co-working space near Union Square. No cameras, no media. Just 6 women around a long table, laptops open, documents stacked. Jennifer called it Phase 2. I called it Necessary. Sandra arrived with a new case file under her arm. A hedge fund in Connecticut. Nearly identical structure? They've already reached out to one of the spouses for early buyout negotiation. Charlotte followed behind her, dropping into the chair beside me, and Westmark's audit team confirmed irregularities in 6 of the Whitman Trust's feeder accounts. Quiet settlements are coming, but you started the tremor. For a moment, the room fell into a silence not of tension, but of awe, and then we got to work. By the following month, I'd transitioned out of my executive role at Bailey Marketing, not because I had to, Because I chose to. I took a consulting position instead, one that allowed me to focus on building a network, one part financial literacy program for high-earning women, one part legal advocacy for those being manipulated in silence. I named it the Ledger Initiative. It began with 20 names. By summer, it had over 300. One evening, as I reviewed a testimonial submission from a young woman in Seattle who'd just left her husband after discovering a hidden trust, I received a message from Graham. Subject: no title. Body: I know it's too late. I just wanted to say, I see it now. All of it. I'm sorry. I didn't reply. There was nothing left to correct in him. Only things to protect in me. Months later, Rebecca and I stood side by side outside the courthouse in Hartford, watching Jennifer emerge victorious from her patent trial. She raised her arms, not in celebration, but in reclamation. A journalist approached. "What made you fight back?" Jennifer smiled. "Someone reminded me I wasn't leverage, I was legacy." As the crowd dispersed, I stood in the sunlight for a moment longer. No press release would explain what we'd built. No headline would capture the quiet power of a spreadsheet-turned sword. But I didn't need validation. I had my name back, my voice, my line in the ledger. And this time, it was written in ink only I controlled. Thank you for staying with me through this journey. If you've made it this far, then you know. This wasn't just a story about money, power, or family legacy. This was a story about reclaiming your voice in a world that often expects you to stay silent. A story about how financial abuse doesn't always look like empty bank accounts. It often hides behind beautiful homes, expensive wine, and words like tradition and loyalty. To anyone who's ever felt like a transaction instead of a person, who's ever been asked to sacrifice while being told to stay grateful, you are not alone. You're not crazy. You're not too emotional. You're seeing it clearly. This story was inspired by real dynamics that too many women face, especially in high-net-worth families, legacy-driven marriages, and generational systems that prize obedience over autonomy. But the truth is, no matter how deep the structure runs, the moment you draw your line, it begins to crack. I want to thank every woman who ever said enough behind closed doors, even when her voice shook. I want to thank those who stayed silent for years but still found the courage to rise. This story is yours as much as it is mine. To those watching who have never experienced this kind of betrayal, thank you for listening. Thank you for choosing to understand. Because allyship doesn't always mean marching in the streets. Sometimes it means believing someone the first time they say it's not okay. And to those still living under the weight of manipulation, financial, emotional, or otherwise, please know this: your worth was never meant to be measured by what others can extract from you. You are not leverage, you are not a line item, you are not a fund, you are a force. If this story moved you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Subscribe for more narratives that empower, expose, and heal. And above all, protect your name, protect your peace, and never apologize for drawing the line. This wasn't the end. It was the beginning of owning the story and writing the next chapter on your terms. Thank you. Madeline?